The tank that did not move. At 5:17 in the morning on July 5, 1943, somewhere along the southern shoulder of the Kursk salient, a German artillery observer pressed his binoculars against the rim of a shallow slit trench and tried to keep his hands still. The light was poor. Not dark. Not yet day. Just that thin gray hour when shapes appear before details, when a bush can look like a man, and a man can look like part of the earth. A few kilometers ahead, beyond a belt of low scrub and torn wheat, the Soviet line lay silent. Too silent. The observer had learned not to trust silence. He could smell damp soil, cold coffee, tobacco, and the sour metal odor of the field telephone beside him. Somewhere behind his position, a gun crew was already awake. Breech blocks clanged open. Shell cases scraped against wood. Men spoke in low voices, saving their strength for the noise that would come. Then he saw it. The tank. Not moving. Not firing. But there, partly hidden under a net, its turret shape visible against the pale line of trees. Then another. And another. Low, dark, angular forms, exactly where Soviet armor should not be if the sector was quiet. He adjusted the binoculars. For a few seconds, the world narrowed into glass. The silhouettes were not perfect. But war almost never offered perfect information. A commander did not wait for certainty when tanks were appearing near his front. If he waited too long, the sound he would hear next might be engines. T-34s. Tracks grinding through wet soil. Armor coming forward before the infantry even knew the attack had started. He called the coordinates. Behind him, German guns answered. The first shells landed short. The second group walked forward. The third struck close enough to throw black earth over the tank shapes. The observer lowered his glasses, blinked grit from his eyes, and waited for the signs every trained man expected. A crew bailing out. A secondary explosion. Flames licking under a turret ring. Ammunition cooking off. Nothing. No men ran. No engine started. No tank reversed into cover. The guns fired again. This time, the shell burst landed directly among the shapes. The turret seemed to split. A hull collapsed sideways. But it did not burn. It folded. It came apart strangely, almost lightly, as if the blast had not torn steel but broken furniture. Later, when German infantry pushed close enough to inspect the position, they did not find destroyed Soviet armor. They found wood, wooden frames, canvas, straw packed beneath boards, paint rubbed into rough surfaces to darken the outline, logs dragged through mud to suggest track marks, a false machine that had never carried a crew, never held a shell, never possessed an engine, a tank that could not fight, and yet German guns had fired at it. That was the first insult. Not that the Soviets had built a fake tank. Armies had used tricks before. The insult was that the trick had worked under professional eyes, under wartime pressure, in a sector where every shell mattered. To some German soldiers, it looked pathetic, primitive, almost stupid. A wooden tank on the Eastern Front, where real tanks burned with men inside them. But the battlefield does not care what looks stupid. It only cares what changes behavior. And that morning, something made of planks and cloth had done exactly that. It had turned German attention toward emptiness. It had pulled fire away from somewhere else. It had created urgency where there was no steel threat. The German observer had believed he was identifying Soviet armor. What really happened was quieter. He had been made to participate in a Soviet decision. The fake tank did not need to move. It only needed him to move first. And somewhere beyond the shell smoke, hidden under trees, nets, darkness, and discipline, the real question was waiting. If the Germans were firing at empty wood, where were the real Soviet tanks? What German observers thought they saw. German observers were not fools. That has to be understood before the story can go any further. It is easy, decades later, to laugh at a gun crew firing on a wooden tank. It is easy to imagine a fake vehicle as something crude and obvious, something no trained soldier could mistake for the real thing. But the Eastern Front did not offer clean museum lighting. It offered smoke, snow, heat shimmer, dust, burning villages, bad maps, exhausted men, broken wires, and fear. A tank seen at distance was rarely a tank in full detail. It was a shape, a shadow, a line of darkness under a camouflage net, a suggestion of a gun barrel, a track mark turning near a tree line, a report from a forward patrol, a smudge on an aerial photograph, a radio message interrupted by static. German reconnaissance worked through fragments. An aircraft might pass over a Soviet position at speed, its pilot watching for flak, cloud, and fighters while trying to read the ground below. A photo interpreter might later study grainy images and search for the geometry of military activity. Rectangles, tracks, unnatural shadows, disturbed earth. A forward observer might watch from a church tower, a ridge, or a hole in the ground, knowing that if he waited too long to call in fire, Soviet guns might find him first. The German army had built much of its early war confidence on speed, observation, and reaction. Find the enemy. Strike before he is ready. Identify weak points. Concentrate force. Move faster than the opponent can understand. On the open maps of 1941, that confidence had seemed justified. But by 1943, the war in the East had changed. The Red Army was no longer the shattered, retreating force Germany had expected to finish quickly. It had learned. It had absorbed disasters and converted them into method. It had become patient in places where patience was necessary, brutal in places where force was enough, and deceptive wherever deception could save lives. For German observers, Soviet armor was never just a battlefield object. It was a message. A cluster of tanks could mean a counterattack. A hidden assembly area could mean an offensive. Fresh tracks could mean movement during the night. Dummy or not, a tank shape forced the mind to calculate danger. And danger compresses judgment. The observer sees a turret outline. He asks himself, if I ignore this and it is real, what happens? If those are T-34s, and they move before our guns are ready, who pays for my caution? Infantry? A supply column? A command post? My own battery? In that moment, skepticism has a cost. The Soviets understood that. A decoy tank did not have to fool a man sitting calmly at a desk. It had to fool a tired soldier at dawn, staring through dirty optics, under orders to detect movement before movement became attack. It had to fool an aerial camera from altitude. It had to fool a map room where officers were connecting incomplete reports into a picture they desperately wanted to believe was accurate. The Germans believed they were reading the battlefield. What they did not see was that the Soviets were writing parts of it for them. A few false shapes, placed in the right field under the right cover with convincing traces around them, could become more than decoration. They became evidence. Not perfect evidence, but enough to enter the chain of reporting. A gunner does not fire at philosophy. He fires at coordinates. Once a false tank became a coordinate, it had already crossed the line from trick to weapon. Still, there was a deeper problem beneath all of this. The issue was not only that German observers could be fooled. The issue was that no army, no matter how disciplined, could see the whole Eastern Front clearly. And the Soviets had begun to understand that blindness was not a weakness to avoid. It was a battlefield to exploit. The hidden problem: war was too big to see. The Eastern Front was too large for certainty. That was the hidden problem behind every report, every map, every order signed under a lamp at midnight. From the forests outside Leningrad to the steppe beyond the Don, from the shattered streets of Stalingrad to the villages around Kursk, the front was not a single line so much as a living wound across a continent. No commander saw it whole. He saw symbols, arrows, unit numbers, estimated strength, red pencil, blue pencil, reports marked urgent, delayed, contradictory, or unconfirmed. A battalion that existed on paper might be half-starved in reality. A road marked passable might be knee-deep in mud. A bridge reported destroyed might be repaired by dawn. A Soviet tank corps shown far to the rear might already be moving at night under radio silence. War reduced reality into marks on paper. And every mark could be wrong. The Germans had learned early in the invasion that Soviet forces could be chaotic, poorly coordinated, and wasteful. That belief had hardened into habit. Even after the Red Army improved, German assumptions often lagged behind Soviet change. A crude-looking position was assumed to reflect crude thinking. A poorly disguised object might be treated as evidence of haste rather than as bait. A silent sector might be interpreted as weakness, not concealment. The battlefield punished that kind of confidence. Smoke turned distance into guesswork. Snow covered tracks and then preserved false ones. Mud swallowed roads and made fresh movement difficult to judge. Shellfire rearranged terrain so completely that yesterday's observation post could become today's crater. Villages burned, and the smoke from civilian houses blurred military movement behind them. Telephone wires were cut by artillery. Radios failed, crackled, or gave away positions. Messengers got lost. Units moved without telling neighboring units because secrecy required silence. And everywhere men were tired. Tired men see patterns because patterns help them survive. A shadow under trees becomes a tank. A group of logs becomes artillery. A canvas cover becomes a fuel dump. A few men moving at night become signs of a larger concentration. The Soviets did not invent confusion. They inherited it from war itself. Then they organized it. Maskirovka, concealment, deception, camouflage, misdirection, was not a decorative addition to Soviet operations. It became part of how operations were made possible. Could hide real units. Could suggest false ones. It could exaggerate strength in one sector and conceal it in another. It could make the enemy ask the wrong question at the wrong time. A fake tank was only one small expression of a larger principle. Make the enemy spend attention. Because attention was finite. A German commander could not watch every wood line, every village, every bend in a river, every road, every bridge, every patch of disturbed soil. He had to choose. His artillery had to choose. His aircraft had to choose. His reserves had to choose. The Soviets began to place choices in front of him. Some choices were real. Some were made of wood. The hidden problem was that modern war had created more information than men could judge safely. Aircraft brought photographs. Radios brought reports. Observers brought coordinates. Prisoners brought rumors. Patrols brought fragments. Intelligence officers brought estimates. But more information did not always mean more truth. Sometimes it meant more ways to be wrong. A German staff officer might stand over a map and see what appeared to be a Soviet armored buildup in one sector. Several aerial photographs supported it. Forward observers saw shapes. Artillery fire drew no immediate movement, but the position still looked occupied. Meanwhile, another sector appeared quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. But a commander cannot defend everywhere equally. He must decide where danger lives. That decision is where deception enters. Not as magic. Not as childish trickery. As pressure applied to the enemy's judgment. What they believed was that observation could reveal Soviet intentions. What really happened was that Soviet planners learned to feed observation just enough falsehood to bend it. The men who made this possible were not always the famous ones. They were not tank aces. They were not marshals standing before maps. Often, they were engineers with saws, ropes, scraps of canvas, and hands raw from cold. They were building machines that could not fire. And in the strange arithmetic of the Eastern Front, those machines could still save lives. The men who built weapons that could not fire. The men who built the decoy tanks did not look like men building weapons. They looked like carpenters under military discipline. Sappers, laborers, mechanics, painters. Soldiers who knew how to use an axe as well as a rifle. Men pulled from villages, factories, workshops, construction crews, collective farms, and engineer units. Some had once repaired carts or framed roofs. Some had worked around machinery. Some had never imagined that one day they would be asked to build a tank that was not a tank. Their materials were ordinary. Timber, poles, canvas, straw, scrap metal if they could find it. Paint if it was available, mud if it was not, rope, netting, branches cut in darkness. Sometimes the roughness of the material was not a weakness. At distance, under camouflage, detail disappeared. Shape mattered. Proportion mattered. Shadow mattered. A tank silhouette did not have to satisfy an engineer at arm's length. It had to satisfy a frightened observer at 800 meters, or a camera at altitude, or a pilot banking through flak. There was craft in that. A strange, humble craft. The builders had to know what the enemy expected to see. They had to understand not only Soviet equipment, but German perception. How high should the turret appear? How low should the hull sit? Where would tracks be visible? How should a camouflage net sag? How much concealment looked real, and how much looked suspicious? Too perfect, and it might draw attention. Too crude, and it might be dismissed. The lie had to breathe, so the men dragged logs through mud to imitate track marks. They placed decoys near tree lines where real tanks might shelter. They left signs of activity around false positions. Sometimes dummy gun pits appeared beside dummy tanks. Sometimes false supply areas completed the illusion. A tank alone might be questioned. A tank beside tracks, crates, trenches, and movement became part of a story. And soldiers believe stories when those stories match what they fear. This work was dangerous in a way that rarely sounded dramatic in official language. A man placing a decoy near the front was not safe because the tank was fake. The enemy did not know it was fake. That was the entire point. If the deception worked, fire would come. The builders had to approach exposed ground, often at night. They had to hammer quietly, dig quietly, curse quietly. A drop tool could sound too loud. A cigarette glow could betray a position. A careless silhouette against snow or dawn could invite machine gun fire. They worked while real guns waited behind them and German observers searched ahead of them. No one wrote songs about this kind of courage. A tank crew could say they fought inside steel. An infantryman could say he held a trench. Pilot could point to the sky. What did a camouflage soldier say? I built something so the enemy would shoot at it instead of us. There is a hard dignity in that sentence. The Soviets had learned from necessity that survival often belonged to the unglamorous tasks. Digging, wiring, bridging, carrying, hiding, repairing, misleading. The famous weapons needed these invisible labors. A T-34 mattered only if it reached the right place alive. Artillery mattered only if its position was not destroyed before firing. Infantry mattered only if the enemy misunderstood where the main blow would fall. The decoy builders lived inside that gap between the visible and the decisive. To German eyes, these wooden tanks could look like proof of Soviet backwardness. To Soviet engineers, they were practical solutions made from what was available. The Red Army did not have infinite armor, infinite fuel, infinite trained crews. Could not afford to let every real vehicle announce itself too early. If empty wood could take a shell meant for living men, then wood had value. Not heroic value. Battlefield value. The men understood that. They did not need anyone to call the idea brilliant. In war, many useful things begin as insults. Too simple. Too crude. Too ugly. Too desperate. Then the shells start falling and the argument changes. Still, one question remained. Could a fake tank truly hold the attention of an army that had spent years destroying real ones? The answer would come only when German guns began to fire. The ridiculous idea. A tank made of wood is ridiculous until someone wastes artillery on it. That was the uncomfortable logic behind the Soviet decoy. On paper, the objections were obvious. A decoy could not advance, could not crush wire. It could not fire a 76mm shell, could not protect infantry, could not break through a defensive belt or duel with a panzer. If the enemy walked close enough, the illusion collapsed at once. To a certain kind of officer, that made it almost offensive. War was already short of material. Men needed ammunition, boots, fuel, medical supplies, spare parts. Why spend labor building something designed to be destroyed? But the men arguing this way were still thinking of weapons only as machines that kill. The decoy belonged to another category. It was a machine designed to make the enemy wrong. And wrong decisions kill in war as surely as bullets do. A German artillery mission required shells. Those shells had to be manufactured, packed, transported by rail, moved by truck or horse, stored, lifted by tired crews, loaded into guns, fired through barrels that wore out with use. A bombing attack required fuel, aircraft maintenance, pilots, bombs, flight time, exposure to ground fire. Even a false report had a cost. It moved through command channels. It affected maps. It occupied attention. It might shift reserves or delay a decision. The Soviet decoy tank exploited all of that. It did not ask to defeat a panzer. It asked to waste one German reaction, one barrage, one sortie, one mistaken report, one anxious note on a map, one commander looking left while the real threat gathered right. That was enough. The idea was especially powerful because it turned German professionalism against itself. The better trained an observer was to react quickly to tank signs, the more seriously he might treat a convincing decoy. The more dangerous Soviet armor had become, the more urgent every suspected armored concentration appeared. A fake tank became believable not because it was perfect, but because real tanks were feared. Deception feeds on fear. The ridiculous idea also had a moral weight. A decoy did not eliminate danger. It relocated it. The men near the false position accepted that if the enemy believed the illusion, fire would arrive. They were asking wood to absorb steel, but they were standing close enough to hear whether the bargain worked. Imagine the moment before the test. The decoy is in place. The night work is finished. The men have withdrawn as far as orders allow. Dawn is coming. Frost or dew gathers on the canvas. The fake turret is still. Real men wait in real trenches, listening. Somewhere across the line, German optics are rising. At that instant, the entire idea hangs on human perception. Not doctrine, not theory, pair of eyes, a report, a decision. If the German observer dismisses the shapes, the decoy has failed. If he recognizes them as false, worse than failed, the Soviets have revealed something about their methods. But if he believes, even briefly, then the wooden tank becomes a battlefield actor. The first shell will decide, not whether the decoy survives. It is not supposed to survive. The first shell will decide whether the enemy has accepted the lie. That is the strange tension of deception. Success can sound exactly like destruction. A shell burst, a wooden frame cracking, canvas tearing, dirt thrown into the air, and somewhere behind the line, a Soviet engineer might hear the explosion and understand, without smiling, that the enemy has paid the first price. The Germans believed a fake tank was an absurd substitute for real armor. What really happened was that the decoy did not replace armor. It bought armor time, and time on the Eastern Front was often measured in blood. The test under fire. The first rounds did not always land directly on the decoys. Artillery was a process before it became a storm. A spotting round. Correction. Another fall of shot. A voice over wire or radio, clipped and impatient. Left. At range. Fire for effect. For the men on the receiving end, those adjustments were a kind of slow execution. A shell lands short. Earth lifts. Men press lower into trenches. Another lands farther right. Someone mutters a prayer or curses, or says nothing because his mouth is too dry. The next round lands closer to the false tanks. The illusion is being accepted one correction at a time. If the German observer believed he was ranging on Soviet armor, he would guide the guns until the target disappeared under smoke. And the Soviet soldiers nearby had to endure the proof of their own success. There is no clean distance from artillery. Even when the shells are not meant for you, they change the air around you. The pressure hits the chest. Dirt falls into collars. Ears ring. Men lose track of time. A minute becomes a long object. 5 minutes becomes a place no one wants to remember. The decoy stands there, if standing is the word for it. A shape under a torn net. A false gun barrel. A painted surface already streaked with mud. It has no fear, which is precisely why men gave it the outline of something that should. The German guns fire again. This time the rounds land among the tank shapes. A real tank hit by artillery might burn, throw track, or shed fragments of armor. A wooden tank dies differently. It breaks open. Its ribs show. Canvas flaps in the blast wind. Straw scatters. A turret shape collapses into itself. From far enough away, in smoke and dust, Even that destruction can appear convincing for a moment. Something was hit. Something stopped being a target. The German crew may mark it as neutralized. That word matters. Neutralized does not mean understood. It means removed from immediate concern. Once the false target is marked as dealt with, attention moves. Guns search for other threats. Observers scan different ground. Reports travel backward. Perhaps the sector appears to contain Soviet armor. Perhaps the armor has been damaged. Perhaps more fire is required. Perhaps reserves should remain cautious. All of this can happen while the real Soviet formations are doing something much more important. Moving under tree cover. Waiting behind a reverse slope. Crossing at night. Remaining silent under camouflage while the false position absorbs scrutiny. The test under fire was not a single event. It was a pattern repeated wherever deception could be made useful. Before major Soviet operations, false assembly areas could suggest strength where there was none. Dummy tanks could reinforce the lie. False gun positions could draw counter-battery fire. Fake bridges, fake depots, fake camps, all of them worked on the same principle. War is not only about hitting the enemy. Sometimes it is about making the enemy hit the wrong thing first. What did the Soviet soldier feel when he watched German fire tear apart a decoy? Relief, perhaps. Fear, certainly. But maybe also a colder awareness. The enemy had believed it, and belief had consequences. A shell fired at wood could not be fired again at a real infantry trench. A bomb dropped on an empty position would not fall on a bridge. A German commander studying reports of Soviet armor in the wrong place might hesitate before moving units elsewhere. The battlefield reality was beginning to separate itself from German expectation. They believed they were destroying Soviet tanks. What really happened was that they were helping conceal where the real Soviet armor still waited. And the deeper reversal was still ahead. Because the greatest value of a decoy was not the shell it absorbed. It was the decision it distorted. The real tanks were somewhere else. The strongest deception does not shout. It lets the enemy complete the sentence himself. A fake tank in a field says very little on its own. But a fake tank beside false tracks, near a suspected road under camouflage, in a sector already watched by nervous observers, that says something. Says armor may be gathering here. Says danger may come from this direction. Says look at me. And if the enemy looks long enough, somewhere else becomes quieter. That was where the real value lived. The Soviets did not use decoy tanks merely as battlefield jokes. At their most useful, they were pieces of a larger operational mask. False concentrations helped hide real concentrations. Dummy vehicles supported false radio traffic, false supply movement, false artillery registration, and carefully controlled silence elsewhere. A commander does not misread a front because of one wooden tank. He misreads it because many small falsehoods begin to support each other. Aerial reconnaissance sees shapes. Forward observers report possible armor. Artillery fire seems to hit targets. Patrols notice movement. Maps begin to fill with confidence. The picture looks coherent. That is when it becomes dangerous. Because a coherent lie is far more powerful than an obvious trick. On the Soviet side, real tanks might be concealed under trees, hidden in villages, dispersed to avoid air attack, or moved only at night. Engines could be kept cold. Tracks could be covered. Units could wait under orders that seemed unbearable to men trained to attack. Silence itself became part of the deception. For the crews inside real vehicles, waiting was not easy. A tank is not a comfortable hiding place. Steel holds cold and heat with equal cruelty. Men breathe oil, metal, sweat, and tobacco. They listen to distant shelling and wonder whether the fire falling elsewhere is meant for them. Whether the Germans have found the real position. Whether the order to move will come too late. The decoys gave them something precious but invisible. Delay. A German battery busy with false armor was not ranging on them. A reconnaissance aircraft drawn toward a dummy assembly area might not photograph their concealment. A staff officer worried about the wrong sector might keep reserves mispositioned for 1 more hour. 1 hour can be an eternity before an offensive. It can be the difference between being discovered in assembly and reaching the start line. It can be the difference between artillery destroying tanks in place and tanks moving before the guns are ready. It can be the difference between a commander reacting to reality and reacting to a version of reality prepared for him by the enemy. This was the reversal. The Germans believed the decoy tanks were weak because they were empty, but emptiness was the source of their strength. No crew could die inside them. No fuel could explode. No ammunition could cook off. No trained tank commander was lost when one collapsed. They were expendable in a war where almost nothing else was. The real tanks were elsewhere, and that was the point. When Soviet armor finally did appear where the Germans had not fully expected it, the meaning of the decoys changed. They were no longer crude wooden shapes. They were part of the path by which real steel reached the decisive place. A German commander might look at a map and realize too late that some of his certainty had been manufactured for him. The reported armor in one sector had not meant what he thought. The shelling had not confirmed what it seemed to confirm. The destroyed tanks had not reduced Soviet striking power. They had protected it. That realization did not arrive with drama. It arrived through consequences. A reserve in the wrong place. Artillery ammunition spent too early. Aircraft sent against positions that no longer mattered. Reports corrected after the fact, when correction no longer helped the men at the front. The battlefield had answered the insult. A stupid wooden tank had no gun, but it had pointed German guns in the wrong direction. Now the question becomes colder and more practical. How much could such a deception be worth? Not in pride, not in myth, in shells, minutes, fuel, lives. The mathematics of being fooled. A fake tank was cheap only if it failed. If it worked, it became one of the most efficient exchanges on the battlefield. That sounds strange until the numbers are imagined not as statistics, but as labor. A single artillery barrage was not just noise. It was miners, factory workers, rail transport, supply officers, drivers, ammunition handlers, gun crews, repair teams, barrel wear, fuel, horses, trucks, and time. Every shell fired had a history before it had an explosion. A decoy tank might be made from wood, canvas, straw, paint, and a few exhausted men working in darkness. The exchange did not have to be equal. It only had to be inconvenient for the enemy. If a German battery fired dozens of shells at a false position, the Soviet investment had already grown in value. If aircraft dropped bombs on dummy vehicles, the exchange became larger still. If the false target caused a unit to pause, shift, report, or request fire, the value moved beyond material. It entered time, and time was often more important than steel. A real tank discovered too early could be destroyed before it fired. A real attack detected too soon could meet prepared guns. A bridge found before troops crossed it could become a killing ground. A supply area identified from the air could be burned before it fed the next day's assault. So the Soviets used cheap falsehoods to protect expensive truths. The mathematics were not clean. War rarely offers clean calculations. No commander could say with certainty that one decoy saved one tank or one crew. The effects were dispersed. A barrage here, a report there, a hesitation somewhere else. A German officer uncertain for 15 minutes. A Soviet column moving during those 15 minutes. But 15 minutes can be a battlefield fact. A tank column can cover distance in 15 minutes. Infantry can shift into assault positions. Guns can finish registering. Engineers can complete work on a crossing. A commander can receive one more report before deciding. What matters is not only the number, but what the number reveals. Deception multiplied uncertainty at low cost. That made it dangerous. A fake tank also exploited asymmetry. The side reacting often spends more than the side deceiving. To check a suspected tank position, the enemy must observe it, fire on it, fly over it, patrol toward it, or account for it in planning. Each reaction creates cost and risk. The decoy, meanwhile, waits. It is one of the few battlefield objects whose success depends on the enemy doing the work. The Germans believed power lived in engines, armor thickness, guns, and trained crews. They were not wrong. Those things mattered terribly. But battlefield power also lived in forcing an opponent to misuse his own strength. A shell fired at a fake tank was still a German shell. A sortie flown against empty would still consume fuel. A reserve held back for a false threat was still absent from the real crisis. This was the economy of deception. It did not replace combat. It shaped combat before combat reached full violence. There is a temptation to admire such efficiency too easily, to see cleverness and forget the mud. But the numbers were never abstract for the men nearby. When German shells hit a decoy position, the blast did not politely stop at the edge of the lie. Shrapnel did not care what was real. Men placing or guarding false positions could die beside them. A successful decoy could save lives elsewhere while endangering those assigned to maintain it. That is how war often works. Survival is moved from one place to another, never created without cost. So the mathematics of being fooled were not only about shells wasted and tanks saved. They were about who had to stand close to the deception while the enemy believed it. And that brings the story back to the men beside the lie. The men beside the lie. The decoy crews lived near the edge of a strange bargain. If the enemy ignored their work, it had failed. If the enemy believed it, fire would come. That meant success could feel like punishment. A Soviet engineer crouched in a trench near a false tank position might hear German guns begin and understand at once what was happening. The observer had seen something. The report had gone back. The battery was awake. The first rounds were finding range. There would be no applause. No one would rise and say the plan had worked. Men would only press themselves into the earth and wait for the next shell. The human cost of deception is easy to miss because the objects at the center of the story are fake. But the labor was real. The danger was real. The exhaustion was real. The men building decoys did not do it on a clean training ground. They did it in weather that cracked hands open, in mud that pulled boots loose, in darkness broken by flares, near front lines where a careless movement could invite fire. Sometimes they had to return to repair decoys after shelling. Sometimes they had to improve the illusion after enemy aircraft passed overhead. Sometimes they had to make a dead position look alive without making themselves dead in the process. That required a particular discipline. Not the discipline of charging. The discipline of restraint. Do not move when the aircraft passes. Do not run when the shell lands short. Do not light a match. Do not speak loudly. Do not leave footprints that point where they should not. Do not make the fake position too clean. Do not make it too obvious. Do not make the enemy suspicious by trying too hard. There is a loneliness in that kind of work. The tank crews, infantrymen, and artillerymen might never know which false position drew fire away from them. The commander might see the effect only as a successful deception measure in a report. The men who hammered boards together under darkness might remain unnamed. War remembers destroyed tanks more easily than fake ones. It remembers men who fired more easily than men who made others fire incorrectly. Yet the decoy crews were part of the same chain of survival. They understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that the battlefield was not divided neatly between real and unreal. A fake tank could attract real death. A false position could protect real soldiers. An empty wooden hull could become the reason someone's son, brother, or husband lived through another morning. But not always. Sometimes the Germans discovered the trick. Sometimes the shelling shifted. Sometimes a patrol came close enough to see the canvas ribs and the rough carpentry. Sometimes the deception bought too little time. Sometimes the real Soviet positions were found anyway. No tactic was magic. No trick canceled artillery. The men beside the lie knew that. They did not live inside the clean moral satisfaction of cleverness. They lived inside blast pressure, hunger, cold, and orders. A wounded engineer near a decoy position would bleed the same as a tank crewman. A sapper killed while laying false tracks would be just as dead as a soldier killed in a trench. His work might be classified as camouflage, support, deception, words that sound bloodless until a shell lands. That is why the story cannot be told only as a clever Soviet trick against gullible Germans. It was more severe than that. It was men using the cheapest available materials to manipulate one of the most expensive machines in war, enemy decision-making. They did it because the alternative was to leave real men and real equipment naked under German eyes. What they believed, the Germans, and sometimes even skeptics within the system, was that wood was not a serious battlefield material. What really happened was that wood became a place where violence could be redirected. But after the battle, when reports were typed and maps were corrected, how much of this work survived in memory? Often not much. And that may be the final cruelty of the decoy tank. When it succeeded, it disappeared. The reports that understood too late. In official language, deception becomes smaller than it was. A report might say that camouflage measures were effective, that dummy positions attracted enemy fire, that false armor concentrations contributed to operational concealment, that enemy reconnaissance misidentified targets, that artillery was expended against non-essential objectives. Clean words, useful words, words without mud under the fingernails. The men who built the decoys rarely appear clearly in such records. Their work dissolves into doctrine, and doctrine into results. A commander receives praise for concealment. A unit is credited with successful maskirovka. A battle study notes that German intelligence was misled. The fake tank itself becomes an example, not a memory. German reports, when they recognized the problem, carried a different tone. Frustration, correction, sometimes embarrassment hidden in technical language. False positions had been engaged. Soviet camouflage was more effective than expected. Air reconnaissance had overestimated concentrations. Artillery fire had been directed at dummy targets. But these realizations usually arrived after the decision had already mattered. A report written after a battle cannot give back the shells, cannot move reserves retroactively, cannot make an aircraft sortie useful again. It cannot restore the hour lost to a false picture of the front. Delayed realization is one of war's recurring tragedies. The men at the front learn first, often through fear or death. Staff officers learn later through paperwork. Historians learn later still through fragments. The German army had entered the Soviet Union with a powerful belief in the ability of speed and tactical skill to impose clarity on chaos. By the later years of the war, Soviet deception helped reverse that relationship. German commanders increasingly faced an enemy capable not only of massing force, but of hiding it, disguising it, and creating false versions of it. The wooden tank became a small symbol of that shift. It was not technologically advanced. It did not represent industrial superiority. It was not elegant. It did not need to be. Its power lay in exposing a weakness inside every modern army. The need to act before knowing enough. A commander who waits too long may lose the battle. A commander who reacts too quickly may lose it in another way. The Soviets placed their decoys inside that dilemma. Official recognition came, but unevenly. Deception became acknowledged as essential. Camouflage units and engineer troops were valued for their role in operational surprise. Soviet maskirovka gained a reputation that would extend far beyond the Second World War. But the ordinary builder remained difficult to see. Perhaps that is fitting, though not fair. The purpose of his work was invisibility. If he was remembered too clearly, maybe the method had failed. Still, there is something painful in the idea that a man could risk his life creating a false tank, draw real fire away from real comrades, and then vanish into a line of anonymous military summary. The Germans believed they could correct the record after discovering the trick. What really happened was that the battlefield had already used their mistake. And the lesson did not end in 1943, or 1944, or 1945. It continued wherever armies learned that the eye could be targeted just as surely as the body. The battlefield became a theater of belief. After the war, the decoy did not disappear. It changed materials. Wood became rubber. Canvas became inflatable shapes. False tracks became controlled signatures. Camouflage nets became more advanced. Radio deception became more sophisticated. Dummy aircraft, dummy tanks, dummy missile launchers, false headquarters, fake bridges, false heat signatures, the principle remained. Make the enemy see something. Make him spend something. Make him decide badly. The Soviet experience on the Eastern Front helped confirm what many armies had learned in pieces across many wars. Deception is not separate from combat. It is part of combat's first movement. Before a shell is fired, before a tank moves, before infantry crosses open ground, Both sides are fighting over belief. Where is the enemy strong? Where is he weak? What is real? What is bait? The battlefield became a theater, but not in the sense of performance for entertainment. It became a theater of survival. Every visible thing carried meaning. Every hidden thing mattered. Every false thing could become real through the enemy's reaction. A wooden tank had no engine, but it could still move a commander's mind. That is not poetry. It is military fact. The lasting lesson was not that decoys always work. They do not. Poor decoy can reveal desperation. A repeated trick can become predictable. A skeptical enemy can adjust. Reconnaissance can improve. Technology can expose what the eye misses. But technology never fully removes the human problem. Someone still interprets. Someone still decides whether the shape is worth firing on. Someone still chooses where to send the aircraft, where to hold reserves, where to prepare for attack. Even in modern war, with sensors and satellites and drones, deception survives because interpretation survives. The Soviet decoy tank matters because it shows the humility of war's truth. Sometimes the object that changes a battle is not the most powerful weapon, but the one placed exactly where the enemy's fear expects power to be. It also challenges how war stories are usually told. We prefer steel, engines, explosions, famous commanders, named machines. A decoy tank resists that. It is unimpressive by design. It asks us to notice the unseen labor behind survival. The carpenter soldier, the sapper, the painter in a muddy coat, the man dragging logs to fake tracks while artillery flashes on the horizon. These men were not pretending war was less real. They were trying to survive its reality with whatever materials they had. The Germans believed the serious battlefield belonged to serious weapons. What really happened was that seriousness came from effect, not appearance. A wooden tank that changed where shells fell was more serious than a steel machine hidden too late. And so the decoy's legacy is not merely technical. It is philosophical in the hardest military sense. War is fought not only against what exists, but against what the enemy believes exists. That brings us back to the first image. A gray morning, a German observer, a silent shape under a net, and guns ready to answer a lie. Empty wood, real fire. The tank did not move because it could not move. It did not fire because there was no gun. It did not burn properly because there was no fuel, no ammunition, no engine oil, no crew trapped inside steel. It was wood, canvas, straw, rope, paint, mud, and still, for a few decisive moments, it was treated as armor. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. The decoy tank did not become powerful by pretending well enough to be real forever. It became powerful because it only needed to be real long enough inside the enemy's mind. Long enough for a report. Long enough for a barrage. Long enough for a commander to mark a map. Long enough for real Soviet soldiers somewhere else to remain unseen. The German guns that fired at empty wood were not foolish guns. They were part of a system reacting to danger as it understood it. The men loading those shells may have been cold, tired, frightened, and professional. They had seen what real Soviet tanks could do. They knew hesitation could be fatal. They acted because war punishes the man who ignores a threat. The Soviets counted on that. Not because they believed the Germans were stupid, but because they understood that fear and training often produce the same movement. See a tank. Call fire. Destroy it before it moves. Only this tank was not waiting to move. It was waiting to be believed. When the shells came down, the battlefield did not pause to clarify the joke. Explosions were real. Fragments were real. The ammunition spent was real. The time consumed was real. The smoke drifting over the false position was real. And beyond that smoke, the war continued. Real tank crews sat in hidden machines, hands on cold controls, listening for orders. Real infantry waited in trenches, their faces gray with fatigue. Real engineers repaired roads, laid bridges, cut wire, moved mines, and buried the dead. Real commanders looked at maps and tried to understand a front that never stopped lying to them. The fake tank was only one lie among many, but it revealed something larger. In war, Reality is not always what exists. Sometimes reality is what the enemy must react to before he knows better. The German observer from the opening moment may never have learned the full meaning of what he saw. Perhaps he was told later. Perhaps he saw the broken frame himself. Perhaps he cursed the waste. Perhaps he said nothing, because soldiers often have no room left for surprise. But the image remains. A tank shape in poor light, a hand tightening around binoculars, coordinates spoken into a field telephone, guns firing, wood splintering under real steel. They had believed Soviet decoy tanks were stupid because they were empty, crude, and unable to fight. But what really happened was darker and more exact. The empty wood made German guns speak. And in that sound, somewhere behind the line, living men were given a little more time. Final CTA. If you are watching from a place connected to this history, Europe, America, Russia, Ukraine, or anywhere touched by the Second World War, share where you are watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family served, repaired, carried, nursed, flew, fought, or simply endured those years, you are welcome to leave their story below. War is often remembered through the largest machines and the loudest battles. But many of its turning points were shaped by people whose names never reached the front page. Subscribe to Warfront Archive for more forgotten stories from World War II, what they believed and what really happened.